Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean here at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon's Davis Lecture to be delivered by novelist Garth Risk Hallberg. At Radcliffe, scholars, scientists, and artists pursue innovative research and engage in cutting-edge creative work across disciplinary boundaries. We are also dedicated to sharing the fruits of their study with public audiences through lectures, conferences, and exhibitions. Each year, we adopt a thematic focus for some of our programming. This year's theme is urbanism, a topic that draws together students and faculty from many parts of Harvard and connects them with public officials and creative artists. One such artist is today's speaker, Garth Risk Hallberg, author of the highly acclaimed novel, City on Fire. Today's lecture is also very special because it is the first of this year's Davis Lectures. The Davis Lecture series was established by Kim and Judy Davis, and I am thrilled to have Kim right here in the first row with us in the audience. Kim and Judy are enthusiastic supporters of the Radcliffe mission to bring leading thinkers to Cambridge for the purpose of tackling important questions, whatever the field. We have two more Davis Lectures to look forward to this academic year. Brian Greene, a physicist and mathematician at Columbia University, will speak on Thursday, February 9th at 4:15. And Davis Sobel, a highly regarded science writer, will give a talk on Thursday, April 13th at 4:15 as well. Today's lecture is called Organized Complexity, the Novel and the City. Garth certainly knows something about organization, complexity, and novels. City on Fire is more than 900 pages long. And I did bring my copy here in case you haven't seen it, so you don't have to just take me at my word. And it is not just about any city. It is about a specific city at a specific moment in time, New York City in the tumultuous decade of the 1970s. Now, in addition to being the dean here at the Radcliffe Institute, I am also a 20th century US historian in the Harvard History Department. So I'm going to put on my historian's hat and introduce you to New York in the 1970s from a historian's perspective to help set the scene for Garth's lecture. First, let's back up a bit. The decades following World War II witnessed the most sustained economic growth in US history. Wealth grew, inequality shrunk. Coming out of the New Deal of the 1930s and 1940s, labor, business, and government officials all shared the assumption that government and the private sector both should play important roles in creating broad-based economic prosperity for the benefit of individuals, corporations, and government. Well-paid workers in secure union and corporate jobs, it was argued, would protect the purchasing power of their fellow citizens through their own mass consumption. Moreover, leaders all presumed that economic growth and post-war affluence would go on forever. New York City shared that confidence. It was home to public hospitals, to zoos, to well-stocked public libraries, an affordable public transit system, and a tuition-free city university. Its public sector even included some social safety net for people who were down and out on their luck, and it enjoyed adequately resourced police and fire departments. But just below the surface, New York did have serious problems, and access to all of those amenities varied along lines of race and class. Only for white middle class and some working class New Yorkers was the post-war era a time of ease and optimism. In the late 1950s, industrial production scaled back nationwide, particularly in eastern urban centers like New York. The garment industry started to abandon Manhattan. Electronic factories, food production plants, and other small and mid-sized employers in the city's very diversified economy began to shut down, eliminating good working-class jobs. Activity along New York's busy ports declined, and with it, employment opportunities for the thousands who made their living on the docks. To make matters worse, the closure of the Brooklyn Navy Yard and other New York military installations cost the metropolitan area tens of thousands of jobs. By 1969, full-scale recession had set in. Meanwhile, many New York corporations began to join in the nationwide trend of relocating to the suburbs. Companies like Pepsi and Shell Oil, to name just two, moved their corporate headquarters out of the city. And as companies left, they took their tax dollars as well as their middle-class workforces whose tax contributions were then lost to the city's coffers. New York responded to its shrinking tax base by turning to finance to pay the bills. The city sold bonds and borrowed from private banks to pay for basic services. Then, as the 1970s progressed, interest rates spiked. In 1975, bankers warned the United States Treasury and members of Congress that New York was about to be shut out of credit markets. New York City's mayor and the governor of New York traveled to Washington, D.C. to request federal aid for New York City. Without it, basic services would have to be suspended. The Ford administration's refusal to extend aid was immortalized in a famous newspaper headline that read, "Ford to City, drop dead." New York City plummeted into a fiscal crisis. It cut 63,000 municipal employees from its payroll, reduced the number of teachers by 25%, hiked fares and fees, suspended building projects, reduced garbage collection, and shuttered police and fire stations. The cuts brought two priorities into direct conflict with each other, namely fiscal responsibility and social responsibility. Decades earlier, labor, business, and government officials had all assumed that these two types of responsibility could go hand in hand. But in the crisis of the 1970s, it seemed like New York City was forced to choose between them. The choice would turn out to be a burning question, literally. Arson raged through parts of the city like the South Bronx. Some commentators accused public housing residents of setting the fires themselves, but the evidence points strongly to private real estate interests trying to cash in on insurance payouts. Hints of such schemes appear in City on Fire. And then, when it seemed like things could not get much worse, lightning struck a Con Edison power substation on the Hudson River. The whole city blacked out, just at the time when police and fire departments were being slashed, which dramatically hindered an effective city response. This is the New York City we confront in City on Fire. For centuries, the tools of the novelist have helped us better understand cities. Charles Dickens brought to life London in the 18th and 19th centuries. Victor Hugo painted vivid portraits of 18th century Paris. Richard Wright revealed a 1930s Chicago as few readers had seen it. Salman Rushdie immortalized Bombay in the first decades of Indian independence. Doubtless, you have your own favorites. Garth Risk Hallberg's novel, City of Fire, joins this tradition, and we are fortunate to have him with us here today to talk about it. Now, please join me in welcoming Garth Hallberg.
Hi, I'd like to thank Radcliffe for having me, and I'd like to thank Liz for that warm introduction. I can say I haven't done a lot of these, but I've done enough to tell you that it's rare to actually learn something when you're being introduced. So that's a great pleasure for me. I'd like to offer a preemptive apology for what's about to follow. As a writer, you start out kind of aggrieved at the fact that nobody cares what you think. But after a while, you get almost used to it, almost attached to it. There's a certain freedom in being ignored and marginalized. At any rate, this whole genre of public talk is new for me and just conceptually kind of bizarre. Last month, Bruno Latour, the eminent philosopher of science, was here, and I wonder what illumination I can possibly offer about cities or culture or life on Earth that can stack up against Bruno Latour. And yet, I entered this date in my calendar back in January because the central theme at Radcliffe this year is one close to my heart and one very close to the heart of the novel City on Fire. As the date has approached, I've been beset by terrors and night sweats, wondering where to even begin. But this last week has been, what's the word I'm looking for? Clarifying. It's been clarifying. It's caused me to completely trash the bit about Dickens and Virginia Woolf and the bit about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but it has been clarifying. Where I want to begin, in fact, is with that horrible red and blue map of America I keep seeing everywhere, or would keep seeing if I could bear to look. Now, anyone with a passing acquaintance with demography knows that this map is profoundly misleading. It gets treated as evidence of a lopsided division between what I believe Dr. Ben Carson called the coastal elites on the one hand and, quote, we the people on the other. Don't grasp the distinction or don't accept it, just look at the map. Coastal elites, tiny, 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 tiny. We the people, vast, vast. And just semantically, who would dare to argue with we the people? Who doesn't feel like giving the elites that last shove into the sea? But with all due respect to the map and to Dr. Carson, the truth is that a coalition of working-class swing voters, business-minded burghers, traditional cultural conservatives, rock-ribbed retirees, and, yes, some misogynists and xenophobes and ethno-nationalists doesn't, in 2016, add up to a silent majority, or even a silent plurality. By an admittedly thin but substantial margin, it's still a vocal minority, as right-leaning coalitions have been in every presidential election since 1988, with the exception of 2004, and, surprisingly, in most congressional elections, too. Given the one-person, one-vote principle, it would be far more accurate for the infographic to feature an auditorium of 100 people, 47 of them in red t-shirts, and 48 of them in blue. Now, 47 out of 100 is still a lot of t-shirts, and the Madisonian system makes generous allowances for the rights of the minority. One wonders if those allowances will be respected by those now coming into power. But talk of the largest voting bloc of Americans as a tiny elite opposed to we the people, or God help us, the heartland, is rank propaganda, and treating it as such would be a healthy first step in the national pogrom avoidance program I think all parties can agree is worth pursuing. In the contest for which end of the political spectrum is more in touch with hard work or suffering, or more out of touch with conditions on the ground, or cozier with power, or more American, there can be no winners. In a more particular sense, though, and the one in which I think the infographic was originally conceived, the red-blue map remains intensely revealing. And that is that the support for a center-left liberalism keen to blunt but not transform the rough edges of capitalism, however large that support is in democratic terms, remains concentrated in major metropolitan areas. I imagine nowhere more concentrated than right here in Cambridge, Mass. Probably nowhere more concentrated than in this room at this moment. And conversely, support for a center-right or right-wing agenda has its base outside those concentrations. It is likely that the center exists somewhere in the suburbs and that the red gets deeper the sparser the population is. Now, ever since 2000, when the red-blue map first reared its head, there's been a lot of theorizing about the origins of this geographic split. There's the theory of self-segregation, that on both sides of a partisan divide, people are choosing increasingly to cluster with the like-minded. And there's obviously some truth to that, but it doesn't strike me as a new development. It's worth noting also that the self-segregation theory flatters the assumptions both of urban liberals who like to think of small towns as havens for racist gun nuts, and of small town dwellers who think of urban liberals as smug, self-satisfied hypocrites. So I'm not sure how far self-segregation gets us as a practical analysis. There's also the theory, convenient for the right and gaining steam on the left, that the uneven distribution of voters somehow maps neatly onto the uneven distribution of income, that the latte liberals have prospered at the expense of factory workers. Certainly, the cultural shibboleths of the tech set and the hipsterati, the conflation of progressivism and consumerism, have done nothing to undercut this idea. And there is a generational sense of classes being formed and dissolved, with maybe the beard as a floating signifier of some kind. But Portlandia remains a vanishingly small political force, and to me, the conflation of the Obama voter and the one percenter is a canard. Suburbs and small towns and rural areas have their elites too, whose fortunes rise and fall with elites everywhere. And I can tell you from experience, a lot of those people vote Republican, as do plenty of captains of industry and finance. More interesting to me, and more plausible, is the idea that perhaps there's a different kind of causal nexus, that living in cities somehow gives rise to certain values and assumptions, rather than resulting from them, as would, in this analysis, living in small town or rural America. The idea is that urban and non-urban America are not even really speaking the same language because they're describing what feels like two different worlds. Now, it doesn't logically or morally follow from the fact that there are two ways of seeing a problem that both must be equally valid. But I don't really want to use this time to pass judgment over whether someone's right and someone's wrong. Rather, having been lucky enough to spend half my life in one part of the map and half in another, and to have now spent 10 years of my life thinking about cities, I thought this would be an interesting time to try to excavate some of the principles and values that living in a city, or writing a 900-page novel about one, foreground in the human experience. How those principles and values are rooted in urban experience, especially the experience of my particular city, New York, and also in the experience of reading and writing novels. Because what I found as I wrote was a kind of peculiar resonance between the two, the novel and the city. That resonance that for me has been the only way to know I'm in the ballpark of a human truth. My hunch as a New Yorker is that some of these principles and values will be, at first blush, familiar and reassuring to an audience of Bostonians. The real value in articulating them is in bringing us down into the complex soil where they're rooted. Because understood in their deepest sense, these principles and values are not only rich and satisfying, but disconcerting and uncomfortable to live with, and challenging, as is any human truth. In fact, it's going to be my contention that humanism, in the age of neoliberal disarticulation, has become complacent precisely in its eagerness to ignore the more challenging underpinnings of its own value system, and that attempting to look at them more honestly, and indeed to confront them, would go a long way toward explaining the massive blind spots that have evidently come to afflict city dwellers, and toward getting us out of the deep democratic shit I'm pretty sure we're now in. Maybe that's what novels are for. Now, one of those principles, I'm going to argue, involves the primacy of the concrete, the situational, the contextual, the local, over the big, giant abstraction. So let me try to ground my later remarks by talking to you first, specifically, about where I'm coming from, about cities and non-cities, and how I came to write City on Fire. I grew up in eastern North Carolina, in a town called Greenville, which at the time was so insignificant that no one really knew where it was. Later, after I'd left, I'd mention the town to people and they'd go, "Oh, right, Greenville." And 9 times out of 10, they'd be confusing it with its larger and more glamorous cousins, Greensboro, NC, and Greenville, SC. "Oh, right," they'd say, "Greenville. I think I went to a cousin's wedding there." And I'd say, "Right down the road from Raleigh?" "Yes," they'd say. And I'd say, "Nope, that's Greensboro." Or I'd say, big view of the mountains. And they'd say, yeah. And I'd say, that's Greenville, South Carolina. But Greenville, North Carolina, at least the Greenville of my childhood, was 18,000 people, some strip malls, a land-grant college, and a fading downtown, surrounded by miles and miles of fields. A little pin stuck into the map of Down East, Tobacco Road. For reasons I still don't understand, I didn't feel entirely at home there. I can remember even at 5 or 6, feeling like a fish flopping around on a dock, unaware that there was such a thing as an ocean. But a lot of it felt to me to have something to do with the town's conservatism, which I don't mean in a political sense. I mean something closer to the town's sense of what makes a character and how to keep a community from being swallowed back into the wilderness that surrounds it. In Greenville, in the early part of the Reagan Revolution, there was still an old-fashioned sense that if you were a boy, you grew up to follow whichever of the 5 acceptable paths the men in your family had laid. And if you were a girl, you had your own prescribed paths, and how you measured your value was by how closely you hewed to the channel. That's if you were white. If you were black, there was a different set of channels to follow. And any tensions that may have arisen along the various frontiers of race and sex and class and personality were not to be spoken of or acknowledged, but suppressed. The very existence of a frontier was suppressed. Well, that wasn't going to work for me. Like many a passionate reader, I found my first escape in reading. Actually, I'm not sure if the reading was an escape from the alienation or a cause of further alienation. Probably it was both. But oh, it was amazing to me at 7 or 8. The cover of every book was like a door. You opened it and walked right across the threshold. And though I loved and love all manner of fiction, the books I loved most then were those that built a world. I remember the 3 or 4 months I spent inside C.S. Lewis's Narnia, which of course enacts in its central image of the wardrobe that very act of opening a door and walking through. I remember devouring The Hobbit in the course of a single 15-hour car ride, lying unbelted in the way back of the station wagon, because those were the days, right? And emerging at a rest stop as from dreams, unsure which world I was in, the Deep South or Middle Earth. But there was another fantasy world I encountered in those early years, no less fantastical or vividly colored. I found it in E.B. White's Stuart Little, and again in Harriet the Spy, and in Judy Blume, and in From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basily Frankweiler. It was called New York City, and like any fantasy world, it was filled with eccentric characters crossing each other's paths. It held a myriad of adventures, of quests, the fabled 8 million stories. But New York also had a few unusual properties. First, unlike Middle-earth or Narnia, you could look it up in the Trucker's Atlas. You could, at least in theory, go there. Second, unlike Middle-earth or Narnia, it wasn't the property of any one writer. Anyone, perhaps including even me, could begin a story there without subtracting from or reducing the whole. It didn't belong to anyone, and so belonged to everyone. A final curious thing about New York, I noticed. You open to the copyright pages of books, and they all come from New York. John Updike has that great line about reading The New Yorker as a kid. He talks about a great river of print flowing from 42nd Street to Shillington, Pennsylvania. And that's something like what I felt when I realized that that's where the books come from. I think I imagined skyscrapers made out of paperbacks stacked on their sides. And I thought, that must be the best place ever. Later on, I became a disaffected teenager in a way that seemed to me then completely unprecedented in the history of the world. Greenville had gone from feeling like a backwater to feeling like a prison, and Stuart Little wasn't quite a big enough channel to run my feelings through anymore. I found my refuge in my new obsessions, poetry and punk rock. Both of them seemed to present alternative ways of being in the world. In my poetry reading, I was promiscuous. In no other aspect of my life as a teenager can I say that, but in my poetry reading. I read Dante, I read Tennyson, I read Whitman, Dickinson, Ashbery. I wrote poetry very badly, but in a way that got me interested in the avant-gardes of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which led back to New York. And though some of the most vital punk rock of that era was coming out of the post-hardcore scene in Washington, D.C., there was also this place at the roots of punk that likewise pointed to New York. That New York, the New York of Lou Reed and Patti Smith and Jim Carroll and Ted Berrigan and Joey Ramone, wasn't the gleaming post-war edifice that E.B. White had painted, but something equally enchanted, a place that was entirely edge, entirely frontier, a place where all the tensions were right on the surface. This meant, on one hand, that it was dangerous. You could get stabbed at your locker or hassled uptown. You could overdose or cross paths with a psycho killer outside neath the marquee moon. And I think I was fascinated even then by the fact that this incredible outpouring of creative expression in poetry, in punk, in hip-hop, in painting, performance art, this thing that gave us much of what was culturally interesting in the world of the 1990s, and much of what's culturally interesting now, came out of a few blocks of downtown Manhattan at this period, as if a garden were to come bursting through some broken squares of sidewalk. How could fear and freedom, creation and destruction live so closely together? On weekends and in the summer, starting at 16, I began going up to DC, which I could reach in 3.5 hours, pushing 75 miles an hour in my dad's old car, to see punk shows and crash on people's couches and effectively run away from home. I'd made some friends there through poetry and punk, but there was also this girl I'd met who lived 4 hours further on, by bus or by car, in New York City. And that's how I ended up in the city for the first time 20 years ago last month. I was chasing a girl. Now, it's rare to dream of something and then attain it in real life without a tinge of disappointment at its actuality. But in this case, New York seemed much as I had dreamed it. Perhaps this was because I hadn't romanticized away the tensions, contradictions, and mysteries of the city. I had romanticized them. And in the 90s, maybe even more so than in the 70s, they were everywhere you looked. It was an amazing point in the life of the city. This was the early middle Giuliani era in New York, and he was still refining the methods of social control and oppressive banality I think we can all look forward to in the near future. But beneath his efforts to clean up the city were traces of the wilder, dirtier, and more heterodox city he was trying to erase. I remember stepping off the bus in the Port Authority bus terminal. The first thing you'd see across 8th Avenue were the glowing neon signs of the peep shows, Peepland and Peeporama. And then way down 42nd Street, you'd see the sign for the Lion King. You know, these two things right next to each other. And the tension, the sense of layering, was magic for me. I was captivated, too, by the dense parfait of class and race and age and sexual milieu. If you were 17 and a would-be poet and willing to say yes, you could hit a reading at a private high school uptown, jump a turnstile, smoke some pot with a future member of the Strokes, go to a bar in the Village, and end up sleeping on the roof of some artist's hovel on Avenue C. You could go to a rave in the Brooklyn Bridge, or to gay karaoke, or check out bondage gear, or become a traveling jester for an hour with a yuppie pub crawl, or spend a memorable Sunday morning being toured around Harlem by a smart and kind and homeless and possibly schizophrenic woman named Deborah Little. You can even actually climb to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge then. I'm not saying I did, because I'm not sure if this is being taped, but one could climb to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge. No one would stop you. And something changed in my writing. For a week after that first visit, and unconnected from it, I thought, my poetry deepened and became real. And then, after a week in which I wrote the only 7 real poems I'll probably ever write, the gift just left me. I knew it had left me. It wasn't coming back, no matter how many subsequent weekends I spent in the city. I ended up not making it to New York for college on account of being unable to afford it. I went to St. Louis instead on a scholarship and wrote 4 years' worth of bad prose and met and chased the girl who would become my wife. After we graduated, she wanted to go to grad school, and we thought, great, now we'll move to New York. But it turned out she couldn't afford grad school there either. She got a fellowship to go to the University of Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C., and I remember thinking, well, the city will wait. The girl probably will not. So we moved to D.C. That was the summer of 2001, the first summer of the rest of my life, the beginning, for me, of the adult world. And there came a day that fall, maybe 6 weeks into my first full-time job, when it suddenly seemed like maybe New York wouldn't wait, like maybe New York wouldn't be there the next day, like maybe Washington wouldn't, and life wouldn't. Like all the things I had loved and taken for granted were in fact radically contingent, hovering on the verge of destruction. I'm going to skip over the bit about how the novel came out of this experience. Maybe it'll come up in the discussion portion. But just suffice it to say that mixed in with all the grief and trauma I felt, and many of us here felt, having watched in real time as thousands of lives were impossibly snuffed out, was a different kind of grief, as if the city itself had been snuffed out. And a question about what exactly it would have meant for New York, this beacon, to disappear. What about New York was unique and sacred and unreplicatable, which was something like asking, what was it about this city that I loved? And at some point, after spending a lot of time up there, bearing witness, and just before I moved there for good, I had this flash of inspiration that everything I'd been seeing and feeling and wondering about in 2001, 2002, 2003 wanted to express itself through this enormous story of 1975, 1976, 1977. That other time when the city, as you heard from Liz, was broken and vulnerable and open and hovering on the edge. I worked through the first draft trying to preserve, in a way, the sense of confusion. The important thing was not to propose an answer of the city's unique meaning, but to gesture toward the question. Nonetheless, the book started to teach me things, as books will when you're writing them. Or possibly the city was teaching me. Or maybe it amounts to the same thing. These are the values or principles I was trying to gesture at earlier, the things we urban dwellers can't easily forget, but also can't seem to quite remember. And to talk about a few of them, I'm going to borrow some vocabulary from a book that became very important to me right around the time I started the second draft, when I finally got around to reading it. That book is Jane Jacobs's The Death and Life of Great American Cities. In no way is City on Fire a programmatic engagement with Jane Jacobs's ideas. In fact, I may be misreading them to suit my own purposes, which is always a productive strategy for the novelist. But I can say that her book, or possibly my impressionistic misreading of it, gave me a way to understand things that, when I was imagining the book into existence, I felt I was discovering on my own. So here they are. Principle 1. It must be concrete. This is an intuitive value for the fiction writer, I think, yet one that a long novel will insist upon each time you start to forget it. Life takes place not in the abstract, but in the concrete, not in rules, but in practices. With students, I like to use the word incarnate. Novelistic truth is a function of what is given flesh in the text through detail, point of view, voice, drama, and above all, context. And because a novel offers room for multiple contexts, it's a unique vehicle for paradox and irony, for holding conflicting ideas in the mind. I like the example of Henry James's Washington Square. The heroine's father, Dr. Sloper, brings into the novel a bunch of moral precepts which are, in the abstract, unassailable. Yet confronted with the concrete circumstances of his daughter's position, he ends up seeming to us, the readers, profoundly wrong. It's also interesting and connected to concreteness to think of modernists like Beckett or Gertrude Stein, who in various projects attempt to evacuate from the novel much of its tropism for what's concrete and specific. But Beckett's work, even Beckett's work, gets its life from the pebble in the pocket, the lone tree, and above all, from its incredible solidity of voice. The primacy of the concrete over the abstract has historically been a little harder for urban theorists to admit, in part because they carry a burden that novelists don't. People don't come to novels to have their problems solved, they go to planners. But Jane Jacobs's work in reacting to the excesses of abstraction in her nemesis, Robert Moses, and in architects like Le Corbusier, reminds us that cities, too, are a form of reasoning in concrete. They defeat, in their specificity and dependence on context, all top-down efforts to rationalize them. All you have to do to see how specifics insist on themselves, to do what Jane Jacobs did, and what some novelists do. Spend a week carefully watching a city block, or a subway platform, or an elevator. There may be various rules and regulations, but there will also emerge from the context all sorts of unspoken pacts, compromises, arrangements, workarounds. The same is true of Nabokovian attempts to treat your characters like galley slaves. If they're real characters, they will surprise you in their specificity. The concrete always wins. Principle 2, it must be diverse. Diversity is often treated nowadays as a commodity, a kind of managed good. But in fact, as Jacob shows, any time you gather specific and concrete parts into the arrangement we call a city, diversity will naturally assert itself. There's an odd fact about plumbing that a perfectly smooth pipe will not allow the water to flow down. You have to have roughness of texture. And in engineering, a bridge of sufficient length that maintains identical tension at all points will break the first time a car drives across it or the wind blows the wrong way. And so in some strange way, it's dangerous to treat diversity as a decorative item or a token of virtue. It's not a luxury product. It's a necessity. This is true of novels, too, and of long novels in particular. It's possible to achieve an effect of ruthless unity in something as short as, say, Malloy or Paula Fox's desperate characters. But if you look close, you'll start to see the irregularities, the diversities, the cracks. And in a long novel, even the illusion of ruthless unity is an impossibility. It took me a lot of trial and error to figure this out. A 900-page novel that maintained the illusion of ruthless unity you get in Malloy would cause the reader to blow her brains out. Even Beckett doesn't maintain it in his trilogy. Variation, I think in the third part of the trilogy, the narrator is a worm living in a flower pot, something like that. Variation and diversity is key. And I discovered as I wrote and revised the novel that the more I could get scenes and characters and sentences to be unlike each other, the more the novel would move and have resilience. Principle 3, and this is going to sound like an about face from the previous point. It must connect. Somehow, for all the various and discrete people and images and scenes that make up a living novel and a living city, there has to be patterning, a sense of unifying commonality animating the whole. It's easiest to see this in the field of literature. A novel of pure randomness, something like Andy Warhol's A, is not a novel which has readers. And so in the non-abstract framework I'm arguing we should adopt, not really a novel at all. Whereas in something like Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections, you have dozens of patternings running through the diverse material, binding it together from family connections among the characters to somewhat more mechanical connections among the subplots, to a delicate leitmotif of hands. It is interesting that we rebel as contemporary readers against the bit where the pharmaceutical company that makes Alfred's medication turns out to be connected somehow with the demise of his train company or whatever. To us, the kinds of connections that Dickens delighted in making in his novels of London, the various path crossings and coincidences, feel artificial, Victorian, unrealistic. Perhaps they don't emerge from the specific and the concrete, but read as imposed abstractions. But I wonder, to play devil's advocate, whether this speaks to some alteration in how we urban dwellers move through our cities and in what kinds of connections we open ourselves to. I can literally remember a night at 17 when I started out on Central Park West in the very nice apartment of an investment banker and ended up on the roof of an artist squat on on Avenue C. Come to think of it, I remember talking to a guy on the next roof over, and he turned out to be the friend of a friend, and also the son of the former bishop of Washington, D.C. Finally, on the principles and values of the novel and the city, I'll quote Wallace Stevens' poem, Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. It must change. Actually, let's just call this what it is, a principle of life itself. Change, change, change. I think when we talk about a novel having a sense of life, we're really talking about it having a sense of modulation, of dynamism, of change, or we wouldn't read past page 1. Certainly, anytime I found myself getting stuck in this novel, whether between sentences or between chapters, I learned to tell myself, accept it. Something has to change. Cities, too, are, as a character in the book puts it, sites of concentrated change. And of course we know this. And still we complain about the glassy condo towers, the disappearance of the mom and pop shop, the growing crappiness of public transit. We're like Edith Wharton's characters in The Age of Innocence, sitting around in 1850 talking about how New York is so over. We retreat, like my characters, into fantasies of stopping time at some ideal point, rather than opposing the changes we don't like with our own vision of change. I suppose change is the hardest of these principles to accept, because it isn't a one-shot deal. You have to accept it anew every day. You have to keep changing. And this is, not incidentally, what I think people get profoundly wrong about Jane Jacobs, and what we tend to get profoundly wrong about cities and urban experience, and maybe literature and politics too. I came to Jane Jacobs with this sense of a desirable what of urban planning, a static target. You know, mixed-use development, human-sized streetscape, the magic elixir of diversity, all the stuff that's become canonical, even if, as I've been trying to point out, we recoil from some of its challenges. But The Death and Life of Great American Cities is a funny book in that it's built inductively rather than deductively. The big idea tying the whole thing together only comes at the end. So if you don't read to the very last chapter, you never quite grasp the why and the how of what Jacobs is arguing. And you never quite get that she's not proposing a vision of stasis, but a beautiful and terrifying vision of constant change. Her final chapter is called The Kind of Problem a City Is, and it underpins all her talk about diversity and specificity and connection. And it's where I'd like to leave you today as we turn to the discussion part of this program. In it, Jacobs draws a distinction between two kinds of systems: disorganized complexity and organized complexity. The names can be a little bit misleading. Disorganized complexity basically means a system whose variables can be treated in isolation from each other. Statistical methods, computers, data are excellent for analyzing such systems. Think of a life insurance company, for example. The life of each subscriber is a variable, but barring some national catastrophe, the life expectancy of a subscriber in California will have very little interaction with the life expectancy of a subscriber in Nebraska. And so they can be treated separately in isolation, and various actuarial principles and laws of averages that I frankly don't understand will lead to predictable behavior for the system as a whole. The human body, suggests Jacobs, is an example of organized complexity, dense with variables, each of them interacting in complex and dynamic ways with the others. Recursions, feedback loops, paradoxes. This is why it's impossible to speak of a risk-free medical intervention. You put a cast on a broken leg, which is great, but a whole range of variables from mental health to cardiac health is affected by limiting the range of motion. It's a delicate dance of nodes and connections, and to change one piece is to change the whole. It is Jane Jacobs' great insight that no matter how useful the drive toward more and greater data has proven, a city is the latter kind of problem, a problem of organized complexity, and that trying to isolate and then engineer its various facets in a static and abstract way will only take you so far. It is the methods of the life sciences, of biology, of medicine, rather than the laws of physics that are applicable here, because again, every facet is knit together in an organic whole. This happens to be an almost perfect description of the kind of problem a novel is. And this homology is perhaps the single biggest reason that from Dickens and Eliot and Balzac and Tolstoy to Mrs. Dalloway and Herzog and Underworld and The Emperor's Children, the novel has been such a perfect tool for analyzing a city and getting at its meaning. For if a novel is to have any life at all, it will ultimately reveal to its inhabitants that creativity and comfort, security and freedom, order and vitality, innovation and tradition, as well as all of the values we would like to think we approve and espouse, the local, the diverse, the connected, the changing, for example, are not discrete variables that we can manipulate independently. They are linked together in a complex network, and attempting to manage any of them in a vacuum will have costs for all the others and for the system as a whole. You impose a more rigid narrative, you cost your people their freedom. You liberate your people completely, and the story holding them together decays into incoherence. You attend overmuch to aesthetic beauty, and you lose the sense of life. You hew too closely to life as it has always been, and you lose all possibility of beauty, all possibility of change. And so ultimately, the idea of a closed society, whether the society of tradition or the society of virtue, is as oxymoronic as the idea of a perfect novel or a perfect life. There can be no possibility without risk, no creation without destruction, and no getting through the whole thing without setbacks, reversals, hope, and pain. You attempt to pick and choose among these to drive toward unity, perfection, abstraction, fixity is a very human response, whether it's coming from the left or from the right, from red America or from blue America. But though the talking head said that heaven is a place where nothing ever happens, this utopia doesn't sound like somewhere anyone would actually want to live. So I suppose we should all be thanking our lucky stars that we're not there yet. Not even close. Thank you.
Let me just tell you a little bit about Claire. She is the author of several works of fiction. I assume many in the audience have read them. Most recently, The Woman Upstairs, which was published in 2013. Two of her novels, The Hunters and When the World Was Steady, were finalists for the PEN/Faulkner Prize for Fiction. Claire has been a longtime friend of Radcliffe, as I mentioned before. She was a fellow from 2004 to 5, and she's stayed involved with the Institute, which we're very pleased about. While she was here, she worked on a novel called The Emperor's Children, also set in New York during another tumultuous time, the period surrounding the attacks on the World Trade Center towers in 2001. And The Emperor's Children was named one of the top 10 best books of 2006 by the New York Times. So now I'm going to move over here. I did bring, this is the paperback, so we don't give quite, it's not quite fair. Yours was pretty big when it was in hardback.
A lot smaller. A lot smaller.
A lot smaller. But I'd like to just start, Claire. We've heard from Garth, and I should say that when Garth accepted our invitation, we were very excited. And he was very open to the idea of having a conversation, not just giving a lecture. And it immediately came to me that Claire was the perfect person to be in conversation because she, too, had written a book about New York at a very particular moment in time. So I'd like to start by asking you, Claire, to give us a little sense of your own story of how you came to Emperor's Children, why New York. You too are not a New Yorker by birth. You, as I understand it, you're part Canadian. Your mother's Canadian. Your father was French Algerian.
He was French.
French.
He was a Pied Noir.
Right. So, why this book? And why this time?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Maybe Garth in a minute will tell us a little more about how City on Fire came out of 9/11.
Because you have that in your book as well.
Right. Well, it happens. You know, it just happens at the end. But I had started a novel set in New York, and then 9/11 happened, and then I had to throw away what I had and think maybe I would write something else, or maybe I would, you know, maybe we would never write again. Maybe it was a time for poetry and prose was finished, and
Certainly not irony, right?
and then when I began, then I began it again with a sense that you know, I mean, the Emperor's Children is a sort of August 1914 novel rather than a, you know, I mean, it's a sort of, it's about the time before coming to an end. And I remember one of the reviewers saying in irritation, you know, for almost all of the book, it just seems like any ordinary year. but of course, you know, if you remember back to 2001 until September 11th, it really just did seem like any ordinary year, which was sort of the point. But so in that sense, you know, the city. I had wanted to write a novel set in the city about people in the city, and that was in part because it's true. I was not born in New York. My father worked in New York. My parents lived in Connecticut. I went to college in New Haven, and then went off to graduate school in England, and all my friends moved to New York. And I kept thinking, there's my life waiting for me. There's my life. It'll still be there. My life is waiting. But somehow I never got there. So I thought, well, I better just make up a story about it.
I'd like to follow up on, I was going to ask you what Claire alluded to, which is that many critics have said that even though your book is set in the 1970s and the event that disrupts the world that you've created is the blackout, that in many ways you were also, that was kind of a proxy for 9/11 in many ways. And so could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, do you remember that there was that whole thing for in 2002 and 2003, almost comical, of like people wringing their hands in the newspaper and like, oh, when will the fiction writers weigh in on September 11th? Which was kind of odd because you were like, do you people know how long these?
Right. I mean, when did the Vietnam stories come?
Right. And so I remember when your book came out, which was that 2006? And like really appreciating how deftly it handled that, because it does have such a large impact on, I mean, even just the plot in a way. And I stole something from you, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, just the way that you throw a catastrophe in the middle of an urban environment and the characters can't get to each other.
Right.
Which can be really awkward depending on where they are and where they're supposed to be. But what I specifically admired was exactly that it did not feel like a novel about September 11th. And I was very keen. The only successful things that I've read that really went right at it are, I think, inarguably Deborah Eisenberg's story, Twilight of the Superheroes, and more arguably DeLillo's Falling Man, but I would argue for. But I really wanted to resist that, and yet, like, I was changed so much as a person by that. Partly by virtue of it really being, I mean, it would have been like turning 22 in August of 1914,
right.
And like leaving college,
right.
Like a kind of Hans Castorp thing. Like, here's the world, and then it just is completely not what you were expecting. That I couldn't not get into the novel, and so somehow I was wanting to write about a city at a time of crisis, but not this crisis, and something came to me.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit more about New York, which figures into both of your books, and you were suggesting even in some ways taught you, as you talked about Jane Jacobs, about how to write a novel in terms of the qualities. Is New York, just a setting? Is it a character? Is it one thing? Is it a very fragmented sort of place that people experience very differently? Tell us about what New York meant to you in writing these novels.
Well, I was just curious because you said, I had assumed that you had lived in New York for some period of time because the novel is very persuasive in that way.
People still say, I'll send it to you in New York. And I say, no, I don't live there.
So as someone who didn't live there, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, as I said, I think I feel I didn't live there, but I lived there, if you know what I mean. My father worked at 50th and 3rd Avenue for 15 years. I think one of the things there were so many things about your novel and so many questions I'd love to ask you in terms of the city, and you imagining the city in the 1970s, which, of course, you are too young to have experienced in any conscious way, but I have memories of I was at boarding school here between 1980 and 1983, and going to stay with friends in New York, and it was the time when you went to stay with friends and their parents were just away. You were 14 years old staying with their parents were just
90s,
away. Yeah, that doesn't happen now, I think, in the same way. But that you really captured that aspect of the city, and of course the place is always a character. For me, at least, place is always a character. I mean, it's a degree then how much of a character it is. And New York being so diverse, concrete, and enormous is going to be a huge character. But for you, it wasn't a random choice to choose the 70s. How did you? So what? New York is such a particular New York.
Don't you have the sense sometimes of? I mean, this is a little trite, but of having the material kind of choose you. I just don't. I'm not a very rational. I'm not a very administrative or top-down thinker. I tend to sort of wander around confused, and then it's like, oh, I suppose I have to write that story.
But I know that I have to write that story. But the thing of New York, of the city, and of the diversity of the city, and of the, as it were, the Hamilton Sweeney's Sutton Place house and the squat, and just things like. Tompkins Square Park, right? When I was in college, there were riots in Tompkins Square Park. I think by the time that was in my novel, Mr. Giuliani had made sure he had evacuated
condos
all problematic
in the center of Tompkins Square Park.
all problematic citizens or sub-citizens, as he might see them, in order to make sure there were no more riots ever in Tompkins Square Park. But you had to reimagine yourself back into a.
Well, there's that You know, the essay that Benjamin's Arcades project sort of erupts out of was to be called Paris, the Capital of the 19th Century. And one does have the feeling that the 20th century version would be New York, the capital of the 20th century. And it's interesting, like the analysis that Benjamin gets is actually very, very specific. You know, it's not just any old place, or it's not just the biggest one of these things. It's like has its own character. And there is something for me about the 20th century having been, you know, a century of, you know, tribes suddenly mixing together and of like great, it's a, you know, probably the most murderous century we've had so far, although it's probably true of every century, sad to say. But at the same time, there's a sense of also the 20th century is the one in which it was suddenly conceivable that people of different sexualities, ethnic backgrounds, classes might, you know, that period you were describing, I think, had, you know, there was less of the social liberation, although that was coming. I think you would still, in the 60s, you know, have rather been in New York than Alabama if you were gay. But there was this sense of, you know, an experiment, like a crazy experiment in, you know, how did you put it? You said the something equality and some social
responsibility and fiscal responsibility.
Social responsibility and fiscal responsibility.
Were kind of in collision in the 1970s. And arguments being made that what was ultimately most socially responsible would be what was most fiscally responsible. I mean, those were very important conversations that people had.
And somehow the whole social side of the city, the whole kind of drawing together of these great masses of people from all over the world was also underwriting, you know, this, and was underwritten by this huge economic, you know, miracle kind. I mean, what now looks to us like a miracle. Back then, you would have just thought, oh, this is everyday life. And what interested me, I guess, about this period is in the novel, and what interests me about like this week is like it's one of those moments where the inherent, you know, tensions erupt, and the question of, you know, is it possible for things to go on like this comes to the fore.
Strikes me that you both have protagonists who are young people. And so some of this kind of feeling one's way in the city is a young person's project. So, you know, you have Mercer, the aspiring writer who in many ways may be you, who comes from the rural South to the city, going to write the great American novel. You have William, the alienated heir to this family fortune, his sister trying to live an ordinary life, Samantha and Charlie, suburban kids from Long Island who see New York as kind of the way to escape suburbia and live a real life. And you too you built your novel around these privileged graduates of Brown University who come to New York with great dreams, but they don't seem to be getting anywhere. And then there's the sort of more working class cousin from New York. But these are all young people for whom the city seems to hold out these promises. Was that, you know, a kind of deliberate decision? How did you particularly, Claire, come to that decision that you would get a novel that would culminate in 9/11 would be about young people's dilemmas?
Liz, I was young. But I mean, I think the city is obviously exactly what Garth was talking about in the early part of your talk. This repository of dream and fantasy, and the, you know, from Balzac onwards, you know, from Lost Illusions onwards, the idea of the provincial comes to the city and discovers all of the things, you know, the diversity and the corruption and vice for the first time, but also ambition. And I'd actually be really interested to read the novel about the sort of 55-year-old doing that. I mean, I think it would be a really interesting novel. But it isn't an instinctive It
I
doesn't
really
seem
like that idea.
Yeah, doesn't it seem sort of
Yeah.
right? Like it seems, but I think there is some sort of the buoyancy of the city and the maelstrom is. It's like the cliche you do it when you move to that's a young person's thing to move to New York.
It's interesting. I mean, when I was suggesting that maybe it's not just that New York happens to be the biggest kind of game in town in the 20th century, but it actually has its own kind of personality. That's maybe a distinction that I would make between like New York and say Chicago or Baltimore or Memphis or something. That there is a specific there's a youth culture. I mean, there always has been that draws people there. There's a there's also it's the city of reinvention. Like you maybe go to Chicago to work on the Mercantile Exchange or but you don't. I mean, I love Chicago. If you're an actor, you go to Chicago to make it big. But in most ways, you would come to New York, and Paris was that in the 19th century.
And Berlin is that to some extent now. I mean, and I think there's also this sense of
Berlin and God help us, San Francisco.
Well, but I was going to say, I think one of the things, maybe not San Francisco any longer, that because the French word that is in my head is abordable. And, even, I mean, if you were telling your story about we couldn't afford to go to graduate school, we couldn't afford, that was my story too, Gray. I could afford to live in London. It used to be cheap, but I couldn't afford to live in New York. And I think that part of that is what you're willing to put up with when you're young. Is it Jenny's first flat that has the bathtub? I remember them, the bathtub under the counter.
I had pages and pages I had to cut of just all those.
You
little,
cut pages, Garth?
Oh, I cut so many pages. It was twice as long.
But what you'd put up with to be in New York, and that's part of the exhilaration and thrill of it. But rare is the 55-year-old who'll put up with it.
So it was also a time of when there were many ways to live in New York, and it seems now there are increasingly fewer. Brooklyn is no longer what Brooklyn was. I don't know what the new affordable part of New York is, but your people are living in all different kinds of ways in New York, group houses and whatever. So, but I did want to weave just a little more time for our discussion before we open it up. I gather from some of the articles I've read that Scott Rudin has picked up the rights to make a film based on the book. And I'm curious about whether that is in fact happening, what your expectations are about the film. In many ways, the novel is a product of the 19th century, television and film, 20th and 21st. Do you think that the film, by definition, will have to be very different? It will be shorter, it won't be, unless you're planning for...
Better be a miniseries, don't you think?
Maybe
they can't do it in 2 hours.
So what's the plan? And did you actually have any film interest in your book?
Yeah.
Yes? All right,
It's a
well,
long
let
and
Garth
boring
go
story.
first,
We
and
don't
then
need
you
to
can go.
Claire and I know each other just well enough, I presume, for her to know that I am very, very deliberate about a lot of choices that I make, let's say. And I've noticed that you look at certain writers' bibliographies, notice like an 8 or a 9 year gap. And you go, what happened? And you start to ask around, and it's like, oh, they got sucked into the screenplay dungeon or whatever. So my policy, having used older writers by proxy, is to remain as remote as I can possibly be.
So you will not be involved in the... But is it happening? You don't know.
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't
But may I ask you, do you have... It couldn't be for a 2-hour film. It would have... It would have to be something. I mean, I think that's.
There's a 2-hour film in there just struggling to get out.
Get out, right. I mean,
we've cut 200 characters. Yeah. They're now down to 3.
Well, the blackout will probably, come a lot sooner.
Well, how do you make a movie about a blackout?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
like what's? I mean, the whole third act. Yeah,
Right,
it's like a very avant-garde.
Yeah.
So, Claire, what's your story with film?
It was just. I mean, I think it was a long process where it was optioned, and then one set of people. You can't imagine how many times I've read in Variety about the imminent filming of my book, but but lo and behold, the House of Cards doesn't stay up, and you don't pay any. I mean, you don't. I think it's so you have to let it go. It's a different medium if they're going to make a movie. And in my case, I think at this point I can say with confidence they're not. But if they're going to make a movie, they have to be free to do.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to be free to adapt it. And there's that wonderful story about Nabokov writing the screenplay for Lolita and them saying, "Thank you, wonderful, wonderful." And as he walked out the door, tearing it up and beginning again. I mean, you can't. It's just such a different medium, and they need the. Any filmmaker will need the leeway to do whatever they're going to do. But you might be surprised and find that City on Fire is Berlin. I mean, it could happen.
Oh, right, that they'll make that dramatic a change.
I mean, I think
right.
it's just it's just a completely different.
Werner and Hans and all of that.
Though it does strike me that this appetite people have now for these series, and watching, they will just. Sit there and watch, one show after another of, we're all doing it, and there's a lot of attention. That's where the writing talent is now in television, not movies and all that.
Well, just to say a little something about that, there was this big kind of, at the time I sat down to write the book, there was a big sort of narrative about, it was like bookstores were going bankrupt, publishers were not far behind, and everyone was said to be unable to sustain attention for more than 140 characters. And I thought...
You thought, I'll prove them wrong.
No, au contraire. I thought, this novel is unpublishable. But the punk in me was like, perfect. Like, then I don't have to worry about, what Heidegger would call das Man, like the they, the them, what do they think? It's just, what does the book want? Uh-huh. But by the time I finished... But I did notice that everyone was, on their 53rd hour of The Sopranos, yeah, right. Which is a remarkable feat of attention.
Or The Wire, or The Americans, right.
And I had this feeling watching those shows that they had stolen an entire, or not stolen, appropriated, adapted an entire grammar from the novel that I loved and could be put to deeper purposes in the novel because of just what is unique about the novel as a form. And I did have this feeling of I'm taking these things back. And by the time I got out of my garret with my incredibly unwieldy manuscript, I looked around and suddenly people were, going to bookstores and, large ambitious novels were.
Change had been happening.
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe these series are sending us back to the long book, which I do want to close on just asking, and then we'll open it up. The mic is in the aisle. So this is a long book, and you've suggested that you have even cut, that was even longer, and you've cut it. Did you, why is it such a long book? And I am curious.
I think if you have to ask that question, it's not a successful book.
Did you worry that if it was too long, you would lose these readers who have
Claire,
ADD?
you reviewed Teju Cole's Open City, right?
I did, yeah.
Wonderful book. And I read it, and I just thought, what an elegant way of going at urban experience. And I thought, why am I not smart enough to do that? I'm just not, I don't have the talent, to adopt that kind of economy of means. But what I was specifically interested in about the city was the ways that they teeter on the edge of falling apart, the ways that they come right up against the boundary conditions for their own existence by attempting to do too much and be too much to too many people. And so I wanted, to make a city out of prose, and I wanted, actually, at a certain point, I cut back. This is the organized complexity thing. I cut back to a certain thing, and it fell apart. It wouldn't hold together anymore, and I had to actually work back out to something slightly larger, and it was really just fascinating and a little bit baffling to me, but I just knew. I was like, it dies, with too much constraint,
Right, it's a balance. You have to hit the balance. And
You wanted to say something?
I just wanted to respond to that and say I disagree with your framing of why you didn't write a book like Open City.
Well, I'm being a little.
You're being a little, you're throwing on the self-deprecation. You don't need to do
My
that.
hair shirt.
Yeah, but it is true that there are two. I mean, it is the novel of the flaneur, as it were, and it is the city as an interior space, the city as interiority, as opposed to the city as the teeming, diverse, concrete world. And I think it's just actually a different novelistic tradition. In which you have certainly as many ideas and as much, and as much interiority and as much history, and a whole lot else besides. It's just a different approach, and I do think. I mean, that balance of constraint, the constraint and freedom, it makes total sense that you were sort of, it's like a geodesic dome or something. You have to get the proportions right, even if that means. But I know we need to move out to the audience. But one tiny question I have for you is that I know when I start something, I usually have a sense of its scale, and I wondered if from the very moment you envisaged, you knew. Yeah.
You did.
I did. I mean, that was.
That's why you put it in a drawer for 3 years.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was 2 minutes and 45 seconds in July of 2003. I thought, aha, and the scale was, and it ended up almost exactly, page count, word count, all those things. What I imagined.
Interesting. So now it's your turn. Please come up to the aisle, to the mic in the aisle. Introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and ask your question.
A question I have
Can
for
you tell
both
us
of
your
you.
name?
I'm Neda Zovic. I wonder if the city are dying in some very unique way right now. I would like to have your opinion. If you look to the influence of money and technology right now, Paris, London, I know really well about Venice, but also New York, real estate has become an investment. You have in these big cities apartments that are empty, that people buy and they don't live there, and then this has become a trend. Then people who don't have a big income cannot live in the city anymore. This is about money and technology. Bookstores are disappearing. I imagine a city where Amazon packages would be delivered all through the city, but there would not be stores anymore, no more bookstores. I was absent for 3 months, and when I came back to Cambridge, I don't know if you are familiar with Harvard Square, I was in shock. Holyoke, the center of Harvard Square, where Holyoke Center is, all the trees has been cut down, and there's plywood everywhere. Places where I used to go as a graduate student just to run for a coffee, sit, read the newspaper, discuss with friends. It was all gone in a very short period of time. Out-of-town news that is in the middle of Harvard Square like an institution, we are hearing voices that it's going to close because it's a prime real estate. So where is the city going to? I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
I'll turn it over to you and say, but I would just say, to come back to Garth's point about constant change, when I was in boarding school here in 1980 to 1983, Harvard Square was under construction. And I went away for 20 years, and I came back, and Harvard Square was under construction. The mug and muffin was gone, but things do change. I know exactly what you're saying about about money and cities, and I think there are obviously very important conversations to be had about that and work to be done. On the other hand, people are moving to cities in unprecedented numbers. Are we not reaching a point where more than half our population is in cities now? People are fleeing the vast red map precisely for the cities, and not everybody's rich. So it seems to me that one of the things that does happen that hopefully is to the good is that there isn't just Paris and New York and London and Berlin, but also Austin, Texas, and Philadelphia, and Seattle, and Atlanta, and so on.
Now I can say, having recently been to all these cities, that Seattle's unaffordable, Austin's getting unaffordable. But you have to read Jane Jacobs on this, because I think there's a chapter about, I think she calls it catastrophic money, and she talks about like how the magic, and one of the neighborhoods she uses is the South End, I think, of Boston, and how the magic of this specific confluence of factors that makes it wonderful at a certain time will eventually lure in, it will become a commodity for those who can afford it, and then kill what was great in the first place. And that's just sort of
the cycle.
That's just sort of the cycle. But but there are places. I spent a lot of the first part of the year traveling around Europe, and it's Berlin is an amazing city because you can throw anything at it, and it's so big that it just sort of swallows it. But Lisbon, Budapest, there are a number of other cities that they're not on our maps. Right. They're not my map because I'm old and boring now. But if I was young, that would be the place, and those places will get settled, and then the catastrophic money will flow towards those. So it's I don't know that trying to manage it by freezing cities in place, there's a degree to which that works, like Jackie Kennedy stopping the destruction of Grand Central Station, but there's a degree to which it's a losing battle to try to just freeze it in place. And I think what I was trying to suggest is we have to oppose a vision of change to the change that's happening rather than opposing it with sort of fixity.
Hello, I'm Jonas. How much research did you do for this book, and how did the research kind of change the path for some of your characters in smaller ways? Like, was that store on that street and so on?
I'll just disappoint you. I'm not a big researcher as a novelist. Someone asked E.L. Doctorow about, how much research did you do? He used fabulously persuasive fictional edifices set in historical periods, and he said, "How much did I do? I did just enough, just enough to persuade you." Like our art is not an art of fact; it's an art of belief. And I did this interview with Javier Marias on Friday, and he did this amazing Marias thing where he flipped it around, and we got to where we were like, "Oh, belief is more real than fact." He had me totally persuaded. I have no idea what he said, but we're working.
Well, but it's clearly true in our new America.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, it's probably always been true in some way, but it's the rhetoric of fiction is very, very interesting thing to think about, and as novelists, we think about it, and I think it's almost something that never occurs to the reader. But just for example, it seems intuitive that the more research you do, the more persuasive something becomes, and yet often the more you pile up, the more anxious you seem. I think James has written really well on this. The more anxious you seem to show the reader, you lose the authority that comes from feeling like, I got this, I know this cold. I didn't live in New York, but I know it. I wasn't alive, and I was born at the end of the 70s, but I know them. And so I felt that the whole fiction-making mechanism would somehow be paralyzed by if I backed up my dump truck of research. And in fact, you get to facts that are not, that are true on the level of research but false to people's memories, and then they'll treat them as false even though they're true. So what I did instead was I tried to write the book and trust my imagination and trust the things that would pop out at the end of my pen. And then when I had a draft, I did go back. I wanted to know if the story had moved, but I wouldn't necessarily change it. You know, I'm willing to let things be.
But there's a kind of authenticity you knew you had to create, even if it wasn't accuracy.
Yeah,
those are different.
That word authenticity is so problematic in a way that no one talks about. But I never questioned the authenticity of your New York. And now that I know that you didn't spend a lot of time living there, if I was a certain kind of critic, I know I would be tempted to be like, is it authentic? But it has the authenticity of belief and the authenticity of persuasion and the authenticity of imagination. And that's the only authenticity there really is. I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but I got this from watching Patti Smith. The performance is the authenticity. There's no non-performed thing.
I read an interview in which you spoke. It said something that's very similar to one of my favorite things that Peter Carey said about writing Oscar and Lucinda, where he said, I looked at it as a science fiction of the past. Mm-hmm. And I do think, you started by saying as a kid you loved reading books that built worlds. And I think that's what fiction does, is build a world. And if it builds a world successfully, you're ready to jump in. As a reader, you're ready to jump in. And I think that's, then it isn't, as you say, it isn't about the minutiae so much.
And conversely, if you build in a kickstand so that it's kind of leaning on the real world,
right.
It doesn't work. It has to be autonomous, even if everything in it is 100%. So Wolf Hall is an amazing, I could have never done that.
Right.
And everything in it is true. Right. I mean, you just know she did a ton of research, and she wasn't paralyzed by it, because she's not me. And yet, it's completely autonomous. It is sufficient unto itself. Yes. And if, Cromwell had never existed,
right, it wouldn't
be any less of a novel.
It would be as convincing. And I mean, the historical novel I always think of as The Blue Flower, which for me is Penelope Fitzgerald's The Blue Flower, which is the ideal historical novel, in which the historicity, is that appropriate in this context? I'm not sure, but it is so profoundly embedded that you forget that it's a historical novel. Then there's a moment where they eat some weird sort of late 18th century soup. And you're like, oh, I guess it isn't now, but it's not calling attention to itself.
And as a genre, maybe this is why I usually rebel against I don't think of this as a historical novel at all. And it's a genre I tend to have a lot of problems with, because it generally tends to, want to lean on the real world for a prop. But the great artists who do it, it sort of...
Right, it lifts off.
It lifts off.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time, and I just want to ask you to join me in thanking Claire and Garth for this very interesting conversation.